I'm Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm the convener of Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University. Lovely to have you all here, and thank you everyone for joining us on Zoom. Our first speaker is based overseas. Are you based overseas? No, you're not.
Sydney.
Sydney, that's right. I'm looking at the wrong program. Sydney. So it's a shame you couldn't join us in person, Ayesha. This project commenced as a result of some brainstorming on what's happening with digital technologies and the future of initially democracy. Because the Gerda Henkel Foundation that opened the call, I think their thinking was, what is happening with disinformation in the US? What does that mean for the future of democracy in Europe? But of course, we had more urgent and more pressing issues at hand to deal with, and that is what's happening with authoritarianism in the Muslim world. So we have leveraged the Gerda Henkel opportunity to focus on the use of digital technology in the Muslim world, focusing on 4 countries: Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. And the question that we were interested to explore was, and has been, what are these regimes doing? We know they have an authoritarian streak, some more than others, but how are they using digital technology to enhance and consolidate their hold on power? At the same time, we know that social media has been a great force of liberation, if you want to call it, a great tool used and moved for mass mobilization and challenging authoritarian control. So that's the puzzle we're trying to resolve. In the course of that, so many other avenues of inquiry have opened up. For example, one is the export of digital technology by China. I saw a recent report, thanks Ihsan for sharing that with me. I saw a recent report about Chinese facial recognition software and cameras being used widely in the West Bank. So now, all of a sudden, Chinese technology is being used by Israel to take control, to provide surveillance and control the civilian population in the West Bank. China has become a major source of exporting authoritarian practices and technology. So this notion of authoritarian diffusion has become quite an urgent matter to explore. Add to that, there are more, it's not a very simple picture, it's a very mixed picture, if you like. Add to that, there are a number of Western-based technologies, tech companies, that also export the same or similar technology that enables the states to police their citizens. So you see a proliferation of technologies accessible to states that allows them greater control, greater surveillance capacity and spying capacity on their citizens. So as I mentioned, as we look into this, more and more avenues of inquiry open up. Another one is the use of artificial intelligence and what that means for, again, for surveillance, spying on citizens. And the flip side, is it something that can be used by civil activists, political activists, to perhaps circumvent surveillance? I'm sure there are ways of circumventing and bypassing surveillance. So many questions to explore. I'm delighted that we have had such a great interest in the project with all the papers. In this event, Professor Ihsan Yilmaz has been leading the workshop. You have been in touch with him through email and phone calls, I'm sure, and messages, sorting everything out. So he's done an amazing job preparing the program, assigning discussants, getting papers in order. So thank you, Ihsan, for taking care of all that.
Thank you.
And without further ado, I think I'm going to stop talking and invite our first speaker. Now I've got the right program. So our first speaker, everyone has this program either on your table or shared online, shared by email. So I'm going to stick to the program, the order of speakers. We will have about 15 minutes for each speaker. And we'll reserve questions for the end of the session. Our first speaker, you will find all bios and abstracts in the program, so I'm not going to take time going through that. Our first speaker is Ayesha Jehangir, University of Technology, Sydney, looking at conflict influencers and the strategic utilization of digital technologies amongst modern Afghan diaspora in the West. Ayesha, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shahram. It's a pleasure to be here. Perfect. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. So I'll be talking about how conflict influencers that I used for emerging micro and macro political influencers in modern Afghan influence ecosystem. And the reason I call it modern is because I am specifically focusing on those who have recently migrated or fled from Afghanistan after the takeover of the Taliban. Before that, I would like to acknowledge the country. I acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Diaspora people of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as a traditional custodian of knowledge of this land and adjacent lands. I acknowledge that First Nation sovereignty has never been ceded or extinguished, and that I am an uninvited settler on these stolen lands. I've divided my presentation into two parts, so I'll be talking about some background and existing research, and then I'll take move forward to findings. Please note that this project is still in its fetal phase, and I've just started to analyze the data that I have. In the 1990s, as we understand that the Taliban had banned the internet. However, now, after taking over Afghanistan in 2021, they use it to threaten and cajole the Afghan people in a sign of how they might use technology to build power. They have recognized in their own words that to win the war, they have to do it through narratives and stories. However, I'm not going to be focusing on the Taliban accounts. I'm focusing on how they use influencers to propagate their message. So they're not as sophisticated in their use of social technology platforms as we understand, which they are beginning to learn. And that's why these conflict influencers play such an important role in their influence operation system. Some background. Digitality is an important part of the modern political influence, and it plays a decisive role in I'm sorry, I'll have to mute you guys because I can hear my own sound echoing. So if you could just bear with me, thank you. So it's a very important part of modern human geopolitics, particularly in how states exercise their control over diasporic communities. We understand that there was a mass exodus of Afghan refugees who fled to and are resettled in the US and in West, and also, of course, in the neighboring Pakistan. So they can control this narrative to shape how the outside world sees a political development unfolding in their own country. Now, we understand that insofar as social technology platforms have transformed how diasporic activists communicate, mobilize, and engage in political events. At the same time, state-sponsored influence operations have also leveraged digital platforms to enhance not only their domestic, but also their transnational reach. Now, my inquiry is situated in the context of political influence operations in Afghanistan, and I investigate how these state-sponsored actors transform themselves into what Gamlin calls constituency building projects, and through which I predict the rise of conflict influencers. They are strategic political communicative actors who propagate state-sponsored influence operations to shape public attitudes, behaviors at national and, of course, international levels. I have, for the sake of this study, looked at micro influencers. That means who have less than 1,000 followers, macro, who have around 10,000 or more than 10,000, and of course, mega influencers who have more than 100,000 followers. And I've been observing and following the change in their following over the last 1.5 years, and it has increased by over 300%. People with just 100, 200, or 300 followers have now become mega influencers in this political ecosystem, influence ecosystem within Afghanistan. And of course, it also contributes to a de-westernized understanding of how these political influences operate in a sudden fall of democracy and taking over by a terrorist organization, an extremist organization such as Afghanistan, Taliban. So why Afghanistan and why social media influencers? We understand that Afghanistan has a very important geopolitical strategic placement in South Asia. And we understand that it has been a site of antagonistic conflicts since the 1970s. But there also has been a dramatic shift in the use of internet and social technologies by Afghans pre and post Taliban takeover in 2021, while other civic liberties were affected. Surprisingly, or as strategically, we can say the internet still stays the same. In fact, the reach has the users of internet have increased over the last 2 years, sitting at around 18% at this time within Afghanistan. But we also understand that these Taliban state-sponsored accounts do not only focus on people within the country, but also specifically the diasporic communities that have. So what happens is that now they are using this to grow importance and social media influence in what Mary Kaldor calls the new wars that are fought on the digital platform and in offline at the same time. And so I'm trying to understand how these state and non-state actors use these digital affordances to shape and complicate political discourse, to analyze how these geographically dispersed megaphons of Taliban political influence operate in the digital space, how they built these narratives, what are the structures and functions of these narratives, and of course, as I mentioned, to contribute to a de-westernized understanding of political micro, macro, and mega influences. Now, so while the origins and aesthetics of these influence operations are almost similar to the Western counterparts, these people are a living record of Taliban's reconfiguration as Taliban 2.0, something that they like to call themselves. So my inquiry is situated in the context of two key political events in Afghan politics spanning the last 2 years. One is in 2022, when there was a suicide terrorist attack at an educational center in West Kabul that was targeting students from the Hazara community in that the Persian-speaking or the Dari-speaking community in Afghanistan. And another point of inquiry is around the new wave of forced repatriation of Afghan refugees from the neighboring Pakistan, which is ongoing right now. So I'm looking at 2 different months, and I have monitored over 100 accounts over these months separately, becoming 2 data sets for me. And so to understand the nature of political influence exerted by these so-called modern Taliban supporters, and how they hijack networked activism and debates to undermine a genuine political discourse and democratic engagement, I ask two research questions. What narratives do these conflict influencers engage to exert political influence on Twitter? I'm specifically looking at Twitter because it's one of the most used technology platforms among among Afghans and also the Taliban, and also to understand the strategies that they use to deliberately misrepresent political and social reality that may polarize digital audiences. And then I also want to understand, what do these conflict influences reveal about the modern political influence ecosystem in Afghanistan, and of course about the concept most broadly within the non-Western context. And so I will now, I am mindful of the time, I will take you to my key findings. I found that a vast majority, that is 94% of the posts, were authored in the Pashto or Dari languages, the two national languages of Afghanistan. The rest were in English language, which suggests that these posts were primarily aimed at Pashto and Dari speaking audiences. We understand that the use of national language performs a version of an in-group identity among these Afghan domestic and diasporic populations. And of course, language being a significant facet of human geopolitics, through which national governments or authoritarian regimes like the Taliban aim to strategically mobilize what Gamlin calls compatriots overseas, rather than engage in broader form of communication with the general public. Then I also found that 20% of these accounts seem to be run by women, all of whom are based in the West, primarily in the UK and Europe. And to confirm, I would then attend these Twitter spaces, the conversations, the live conversations that happen on Twitter as part of the strategic mobilization, to make sure to hear them speak as well. And so that was my evidence that these were run by women as well, which is very interesting facet of this political influence ecosystem, because we know that women are not allowed into the public space in Afghanistan by the Taliban, and schools have been closed, universities have been closed. And so it's very interesting when they hire or engage with women influencers overseas to project their ideas. And so these accounts showed the behaviors that were inconsistent with grassroots activities, but were consistent with astroturfing. Now, astroturfing will mean that they are engaging in social media warfare, disseminating state-orchestrated political agendas to domestic and wider global audience in the guise of mobilization and transnational activism, and also, of course, in the guise that we are here to save you, to protect you from the evils of the democratic government that they call. Taliban-related propaganda on Twitter was consistent with boosting the political standing of the Taliban leaders, including the head of the organization, Hibatullah Akhundzada, who, for your information, has never made an in-person or an online public appearance. So there are information, or it is believed that he may have been killed by the ISI or the military in Pakistan, but they don't want to discredit their leadership, and so they continue to make sure that they remind people that he's very well, and the fact that he does not take pictures or come online is because it's against the Sharia. I also observed that these accounts, both in Afghanistan and in the West, engaged in manipulating public sentiment, spreading disinformation, specifically about the former democratic government, and to alter public understanding of the issues that, for example, swaying public support and creating a new information environment to serve the political agenda. I also observed that some of these conflict influencers leveraged their network to reach out to national and international media, to give interviews, to garner a wider public support for domestic and foreign policy objectives, and to shape how the outside world sees a political development in their homeland. 78% capitalized on this populist narrative, juxtaposing the poor Afghan people and the previous democratic government against each other. This suggests a strategy where these influencers speak, quote unquote, to the ordinary Afghan person, specifically targeting young supporters and younger members of the Taliban, reinforcing the idea that the democratic elected president abandoned them and fled instead of staying in the country with his people. And at the same time, they also romanticize this concept of jihad as a mandatory value for, quote unquote, the true Muslim. Most of such micro-influencers or macro-influencers are settled in the West, and that could be noted in their bios and, of course, through some of the posts that they share, showing them in the Western, in one of the Western countries. And so they continue to narrate the past and then compare it to the future of Afghanistan and what it means to be Afghan. For instance, there was this hashtag that was launched, hashtag United Afghan or United Afghanistan, to build this support. But what was most interesting was that there were 5 recurrent themes of myths and disinformation across the data. So while I was clustering them and trying to look at the nodes and how they connect, there were 5 themes. For instance, a narrative about the need and practicality of the Sharia law to justify why there should be a Sharia law in the country, and why it's the right choice. And then narratives that called supporters of democracy as the devil's advocate, including Afghan refugees in Pakistan, who, according to these influencers and, of course, as the megaphones of Taliban, were not patriotic enough to stay in their country and leave and abandon their country to go to another country, which Taliban now have shifted their relationship with the Pakistani government and the ISI, consequently the intelligence. Then I also observed a large amount of narratives that presented the IS, which is the Islamic State of Khorasan province. So these are the Islamic State affiliates in Afghanistan and called the ISKP. So the Taliban and the Taliban propagandists and these influencers showed them as terrorists, the ISKP, and the enemies of Hazara and enemies of the state, who, according to these influencers, were the ones who perpetrated the attack on the Kaj Education Center, which later emerged. So the hashtag Stop Hazara Genocide also emerged from this event, which is also something that I continue to look into. Then there were also these narratives that were dismissed, that dismissed that the Americans were supporting the Taliban, given that there is evidence and information on the fact that the Taliban continue to receive $44 million from the American government every week. So that, and there is evidence, but these influencers continue to dismiss this for the ordinary Afghan public, to create this to complicate this discourse and to create uncertainty and of course to project their propaganda. And lastly, I noticed narratives that focused on the development and progress under the Taliban de facto government, including disinformation about the dramatic decrease in terrorist attacks across the country, which is not true, because terrorist attacks continue to happen, but these supporters continue to blame ISIS, which is the ISKP in Afghanistan, for this. You can see the screenshots. These are just some sample screenshots of how they continue to project the agenda and the ideology, and of course how Taliban are quote unquote progressive and are working towards the development of the Afghan country and people and its economy. And then they also regularly become part of these Twitter spaces. As you can see the screenshot on the right side, the title says that it's on the schools and the district level, free discussion. So an open discussion, like a public sphere, but in the digital sphere. So they continue to make presence, to make people feel that they're accessible and that they're there for their people, while the democratic leader fled and left people. So I continue to in my inquiry into this, and I would love to hear if you've got any.
Thanks so much, Ayesha. Fascinating presentation, and it does beg the question: if these influencers are so pro-Taliban, why did they take sanctuary elsewhere? Anyway, we have two discussants for your presentation, Ayesha. First one,
Kate.
I'd like to invite Kate. Where is Kate? Is Kate online?
Yes.
Okay. So Kate FitzGerald, here we go. Good to have you, Kate. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Ayesha, for that presentation. That was really, really interesting. It's sort of an area that I'm not hugely familiar with, so I learned a lot. Something that really stood out to me was the use of women influencers, 20%, particularly as you noted in an Afghan context, I think is really fascinating. So obviously you're the expert on, Afghanistan in this context. So I was just going to make a few suggestions for literature that you might want to draw on in your literature review. And I have had a look at your paper thus far. So something that I noticed that you talk about is, Twitter behavior being inconsistent with the grassroots movement. Something that I think that could be interesting to look at is maybe the idea of trading up the chain that Marwick and Lewis recommend in 2017. And that could maybe help address the ideas of conflict influencers leveraging their ideas. So that was just one suggestion I was going to make. And also, Darren Linville and Patrick Warren have some work on manufacturing specialized disinformation. So that's like state-sponsored disinformation. I'm sure you're probably aware of all of these, but I just wanted to sort of flag that those might be of interest to you. And then finally, I thought that Kate Starbird's paper on disinformation as collaborative work could be of interest as well. And so I've noticed that you're working on the micro influencers and then the mega influencers. And I think I'd just be interested to read the justification for those types of influencers rather than meso influencers as well. So again, I'm sure you just didn't have time to go into it in your presentation, but that's something that I would be interested in reading about. Kate Starbird's work also in 2023 had a look at the different types of influencers and the roles that they play in sort of leveraging narrative. So I thought that that might be of interest to your work as well. But yeah, apart from that, obviously, yeah, you're the expert on the sort of what's happening here. And I think also just a note about the digital ethnography method of listening in on Twitter Spaces, I think is like a really new and cool methodology. So I just wanted to note that, and I think that's really interesting. So yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, and I hope this has been a bit helpful. But I'll write an email to you as well.
Oh, thank you. This is really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. Okay, we also have Ihsan again.
Yes. Thank you, Ayesha. I felt a little bit awkward when listening to a presentation on Taliban and how they use technology. When they came into power more than two decades ago in Afghanistan for the first time, there were several Turkish schools there, and they were invading everywhere and destroying technology. And I listened to this from a few Turkish teachers who worked there, and they said they didn't want them to destroy the computers. And they told them that, look, these are Muslim computers. And they said, prove. They just inserted CDs. They didn't have Spotify at the time, of course, Quran CDs. And the computer started reciting Quran, and they said, okay, this is a Muslim computer, so they're not destroying it. So anyway, so it's still funny that they use technology a lot while on the one hand objecting to it. Your paper, it's rich. I read your draft as well. It's wonderful. It will develop more, of course, it's not complete. The concept conflict influencers is great. You are actually combining two worlds, offline and online. That's very good, and the paper reflects that, of course. You talk about manipulating public sentiment, and yes, I can see that in the paper you talk about how pro-Taliban conflict influencers have been doing that. But to give some broader context, maybe you can talk about which public are they trying to manipulate back in Afghanistan, or diaspora groups, or any Western societies. And also, is this a one-way street, two-way street? Are there any conflict influencers back in Afghanistan trying to influence diaspora? So I am wondering about these transnational aspects as well, because as you know, my ARC project with Korea looks at how Turkish and Indian governments are trying to influence their diasporas through digital technologies. So I am really interested to hear about that, but this could be another paper. So, and also a kind of table or matrix could help you. Who are the actors, what they do, what kind of messaging they spread, who are the targets, and what are the tools, digital tools they've been using. So it will simplify your data in terms of giving some background. Of course, I know that you focused on 100 Twitter accounts, which is great. And while doing this, I also wondered if you can come up with a sort of emotional map. So what the content of their messages, not in terms of ideas, but in terms of emotions, hatred, love, and prejudice, and other things. This could be helpful. So you have 100 accounts data there, it is already there, and I think this could be done very easily, and you can maybe come up with another paper on that. And also any conspiracy theories, again, targeting whom, what is the content, anti-West, pro-China, and so on, this can help. And also, I was a little bit surprised that they use Twitter, because normally you would expect that they use Facebook, maybe TikTok. So it's strange they use Twitter Space. And also to give some background, are they also using Clubhouse, for instance, or who uses Clubhouse, Facebook, and TikTok? If there is any data on that, this could also help with your background information. And also, how do they really operate in the cyberspace? Yes, you are only looking at Twitter space and these Twitter accounts, but generally, is there any report, any other studies that how these people operate in the cyberspace? Any hashtag operations, any flooding, any other digital information operation techniques? Thank you. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Ihsan. Thanks, Ayesha. Is there any, do you have any thoughts, any comments you'd like to share with our discussants right now? Otherwise, we move on to our next presentation.
You just said that thank you for valuable comments. And yes, I have another paper where I'm only looking at how the Taliban. So that's a separate one. In fact, this came out of that one. So, but your suggestions are really helpful for both of these papers. Thank you.